Kate Lang is such a great character name. How much time did you play tooling around with that before settling on it? And anything else about her origin story that you would share with viewers?
Those are good questions, because some of it was a little bit of trial by fire, I have to say. I did know that when I decided to write a character who was a lawyer, I thought, well, because I knew the culture, I worked in a big firm, I sort of understood some of the dynamics. I thought it's really challenging for people who don't have a certain pedigree, who, uh, you know, in Kate's instance, what would be the most embarrassing thing to deal with, or the thing that you would feel the most uncomfortable about, and that would be either you're a criminal or your father is a notorious criminal, which is what happened to Kate. And then, but I also thought she needs to live. That's not her fault. Like that's not a crime that she, I think one of the themes in my books is the sins of the father. Like how are you defined by that, and can you move past it? But for Kate, she also has the fallout of the sins of her father. Is she something happened to her, and she did something that it has haunted her, and this is this car accident with her sister. So it's like tragedy upon tragedy, and I think people relate to that because that can happen. There's all these unintended consequences of one act. And I thought it was an interesting thing to do, to show it in somebody who is representing justice, in that sense. They are the face of it. They are the people who help other people or steer them in other ways. So that is kind of how I came up with Kate. The name Kate, it's interesting because I s- I know I realized for myself as a writer, I tend to stay away from names that are too complicated. I also felt it was a name that was fairly universal in other languages, and it's simple, you
Kate
know.
Lang, you mean as a
Yeah, yeah. But even just the first name, I usually come up with my first names. I have noticed I have a tendency to have names with A's in them. It's just for whatever reason I do. But it's naming is really important and really challenging for me. Like I need the name, I need the title, I need the name. It gives me there's significance to them for me that helps me with when I'm writing. Gives me a world, it gives me a context.
so you come up with those typically before you begin a book.
Oh yeah, yeah. So my writing process, and I'm sure you've heard many. So and this is what it's saying, because I know some people are just, they come up with a character or whatever, and they're able to just put it all on the page, and then they reshape it the way they want to. I'm the opposite. So I write, I would say 70% of my writing occurs before I write the book. And that is very much, I research, I figure out what I want to write about, and that's usually, sometimes it can happen so randomly, and the question sits in my mind, and then, or I'm reading something and I get a question. It's usually news or policy or something, and then I start figuring out how I could make a story around it, and what would be interesting about that story for people. How would it relate to people's lives? Because I think that's really important. And then I start working out who are the players, like who would be involved in this, and what's their story, and what's their world like. So I actually read like memoirs and biographies of people who work in those. All of my books do. Damaged, every single one I usually end up reading, so I can get a voice, I can get a sense of the world that people are living in, because they all live, you know we all have different bubbles. I'm now using bubble because of COVID, but we all do have different worlds that we inhabit. And when those worlds collide, when those worlds intersect, it's interesting to show those differences. And that's what I try to do. And then I interview people. So I come up with a scenario, I come up with a case, and then I reach out to subject matter experts. So when I wrote Damaged, I really had to rely on the fact that people might want to talk to me, maybe because I was a lawyer, because I didn't really have as many connections at that time. And although I have a few close connections who are prosecutors, and they did help me get in touch with people in the homicide department, which was super helpful. Now I actually have a police detective who who I send everything to, and we go through it, and he takes me through, or he'll put me in touch with people. But you know, for damaged, I spoke to forensic pathologists and homicide detectives, and then also the forensic investigative services. And in indefensible, I spoke to psychologists, and I think I even went and spoke to a judge because I had some court cases there, and criminal defense lawyers and prosecutors. I go to court sometimes. I just sit and watch court. So my brother-in-law is actually a crown prosecutor. He tells me maybe when some of the interesting cases come up, and I go and I watch them. It's a big, you know, for tattooed, I interviewed a tattoo artist.
So everyone wants to murder their boss at some point. Was Randall Barrett an Indefensible based on any real life muse? And what made you want to push Kate out further onto the edge in that second book?
You know, it's been interesting is every time I write a book, there's always one character I come up with when I go, oh, I need to write a book about him. So when I wrote Damaged, Randall Barrett was not in the first 100 pages. I wrote the first 100 pages, and then I thought, I'm missing something. There's a dynamic I'm missing here. I need something more. I came up with Randall Barrett, and he's really honestly inspired by so many personalities that I've met in my careers. There's a certain, you know, I think the kind of workplaces that I've worked in attracts a certain type of personality, and I've witnessed it over and over again. And I decided to make him, the kind of man that he's very powerful and very charismatic. And for someone like Kate, it would scare her. So she's attracted to him, but everything that he represents is something that would have a big danger sign on it for her. And so when I wrote Damaged, I really played with the dynamic between them in terms of the power that was there, of him being her boss, her being on probation. He didn't want her there. She had to prove herself. He betrays her, you know, and then he's remorseful. You know, there's like a whole dynamic. There's this unspoken sexual tension there that really nothing ever happens in the book. But I think in a lot of these workplaces, it can be there. You know, that's what I've observed when you know, you just sort of see these sort of interesting dynamics sometimes. So Randall was kind of one of those guys that just leapt off the page to me when I started writing him. I was just like, whoa, okay, you know, you fill the room. So what would you do to someone like Randall? Like, what would be the worst thing with someone like Randall? And it would be, he's a man who defines himself by his success, for better or for worse. So it's not a judgment, because a lot of people do. So what happens when you pull that all away from him? What does he have left? And that was the question I was exploring with Indefensible. So even though it's a Kate Lang book, but it's really about Randall's journey, because he has to recognize that what he filled his life with after his marriage ended was something that was not real in a way.